She was the most brilliant woman in 12th century France. He was her tutor, her confessor, her forbidden obsession. They fell in love in secret. They had a child in secret. They married in secret. And the church destroyed them both for it. But here is what the official records never told you. What happened to these two people was not a tragedy of passion. It was a calculated act of erasure. And the letters they left behind, hidden for nearly 1,000 years, prove that someone powerful was terrified of what they represented. This is the story of Héloïse and Abelard. And almost none of what you've heard is the full truth. Paris, 1115 AD. The city is barely a city at all. A muddy, stinking maze of wooden houses, church spires, and open sewers crawling along the banks of the Seine. There are no printing presses, no newspapers, no public squares of free thought. There is only the church. The church decides what is true, what is sinful, what is allowed to be known. And in this world, there is one man who is making the entire religious establishment deeply, dangerously uncomfortable. His name is Peter Abelard. He is 36 years old. He is the most celebrated philosopher in Europe. Students travel from England, from Italy, from Spain just to sit at his feet and listen to him speak. He has the kind of mind that appears perhaps once in a generation, sharp, relentless, fearless. And he is arrogant about it. Beautifully, catastrophically arrogant. Abelard doesn't just teach theology. He challenges it. He insists that faith must be examined through reason. That blind devotion is not virtue, it's intellectual cowardice. He tells his students, in plain language, that the church fathers sometimes contradicted each other, and that someone ought to say so. He published a work called Sic et Non, Yes and No, which laid out 158 theological questions the church couldn't cleanly answer. The bishops loathed him. They feared him. But no one could touch him. Not yet. And then Abelard made the one mistake that powerful men have always made. He fell in love. Her name was Héloïse d'Argenteuil. She was 17 years old, and she was already a legend. In an era when women were educated, if at all, only to read psalms and manage a household, Héloïse had mastered Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. She could debate philosophy, quote classical literature, and write theological arguments that stunned scholars twice her age. She lived with her uncle, Canon Fulbert, a cathedral clergyman of middling power and enormous pride. He loved his niece's intelligence the way men of that era loved a rare bird, with ownership dressed up as admiration. Here is the first question the historians gloss over. Why did Fulbert invite Abelard, the most famous, most controversial philosopher in France, into his home to tutor his teenage niece? Abelard himself would later admit, with startling honesty, that he sought the arrangement. He had heard of Héloïse. He engineered his own access to her. He later wrote, I considered all the usual attractions for a lover and concluded she was the one to bring to my bed. Those are his words. Let them sit with you. He was her teacher. He had authority over her education, her daily schedule, her intellectual life. She was a teenager living in her uncle's house with no power to refuse or resist. But what unfolded was not. And this is where history becomes genuinely complicated, a simple story of predation. Because Héloïse wrote back, argued back, chose back. Her letters to Abelard reveal a woman of devastating clarity. She was not seduced into confusion. She walked toward this love with her eyes fully open, and she understood the consequences better than he did. That is the first curiosity loop. Hold that thought. Within months, Abelard and Héloïse were conducting an affair in the house of her unsuspecting uncle. They met under the cover of late-night lessons. They communicated through coded manuscripts. They turned the sacred space of intellectual study into something the church would have called profane. Abelard later wrote that they neglected philosophy entirely. Every meeting became about each other. Every lesson became a disguise. He was risking his career, his reputation, his standing in the church. She was risking everything. Then Héloïse discovered she was pregnant. Abelard, in a panic, smuggled her out of Paris in the night, disguised, some accounts say, as a nun, to his sister's home in Brittany, far from the city, far from Fulbert, far from scrutiny. There, she gave birth to a son. She named him Astrolabe, after an astronomical instrument, a device used to navigate by the stars. Think about that name for a moment. A woman in the 12th century, in labor in a stranger's house, far from everyone she knew. And she named her child after a tool for finding your position in the universe when you are lost. Abelard returned to Paris. He went to Fulbert. He confessed everything. And then he made an offer that Héloïse begged him not to make. He proposed marriage. Now, here is what the history books reduced to a footnote. Héloïse refused. Not because she didn't love him. She loved him with a ferocity that leaps off the page even 9 centuries later. She refused because she understood something Abelard did not. She wrote to him, and these letters survive, arguing that marriage would destroy him, that a philosopher's mind belongs to the world, not to a wife, that to chain a man of his gifts to domestic obligation was to murder something sacred. She wrote, "I would rather be your mistress than the empress of the world." She was not being passive. She was not being romantic. She was making a philosophical argument against marriage. In 1116 AD, as a teenager, and Abelard overruled her. They married in secret. No announcement. No celebration. Just a private ceremony at dawn, witnessed by a handful of trusted souls, and then they separated. She to a convent, he to his studies, to protect the secret. Fulbert agreed to keep it quiet. He didn't. Canon Fulbert began to whisper, then to tell, then to spread the truth of the marriage through Paris in a way that publicly humiliated both of them. Abelard, perhaps fearing for Héloïse's safety, moved her into the convent of Argenteuil, where she had been schooled as a girl. He dressed her in novice's robes to protect her from Fulbert's growing rage. To Fulbert, this looked like one thing: abandonment. He decided that Abelard had used his niece, secretly married her to claim respectability, and then discarded her behind convent walls. What Fulbert did next was so extreme, so violent, so calculated, that it stunned all of medieval Paris. He hired men. On a dark night, they broke into Abelard's room, and they castrated him. Abelard wrote of this night himself. He described not just the physical devastation, but the shame, a shame he considered worse than the pain. In medieval society, bodily wholeness was connected to spiritual integrity. What had been done to him was not just assault. It was symbolic annihilation. 2 of Fulbert's men were caught. Their punishment, by the brutal logic of the era, was to have the same mutilation performed on them. Fulbert lost some of his property and his clerical standing. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part is what the church did next. With Abelard physically broken and psychologically shattered, the church moved swiftly. His enemies, the bishops, the abbots, the theologians who had spent years waiting for a crack in his armor, descended. Within years, a church council condemned his writings. His books were burned in front of him. He was forced to throw his own work into the fire with his own hands. He was exiled, persecuted, driven from one monastery to another. And Héloïse? She was never given a choice at all. She took her full vows as a nun, and eventually became prioress, then abbess. Not, her letters suggest, out of spiritual calling, but out of obedience to Abelard's wish. She wrote to him years later, "It was not devotion to God that brought me to the religious life. It was your command alone." Read that line carefully. A woman who may have been the finest female intellect of the medieval age spent her life enclosed in a convent because the man she loved, and the church that governed both their lives, left her no other permissible existence. They exchanged letters for the rest of their lives. Letters so raw, so theologically brilliant, so emotionally devastating that scholars debated for centuries whether they could possibly be real. They are real. Historians try to soften them, tried to reframe them as purely spiritual, tried to make Héloïse into a model of holy renunciation rather than a woman living with permanent, aching grief. She was both. That was the cruelty of it. Abelard died in 1142. Héloïse outlived him by more than 20 years. She requested one thing, that when she died, she be buried with him. She was. Their remains were eventually moved to the Père Lachaise cemetery in Paris, where their tomb still stands today. Every single day, strangers leave flowers there, leave handwritten letters, leave small tokens of love. People who have never heard the full story of what was done to these 2 people, of the church's long campaign to contain them, condemn them, and control what was remembered about them, still feel, somehow, the gravity of that tomb. But here is what I want to leave you with. Before all of it, before the disgrace, the exile, the mutilation, the convent walls, Héloïse wrote Abelard a letter. In it, she said something that the church could not burn, could not reframe, and cannot be explained away. She said that she would rather be called his whore than the empress of the world, that she wanted him not for his money, not for his title, but for himself alone. A woman in 1116 AD articulating selfless love, intellectual autonomy, and the rejection of institutional marriage, not out of rebellion, but out of conviction. The church called it sin. We call it humanity. And here is the question I want you to sit with tonight. If Héloïse had been born a man, if she had published her philosophy under her own name, argued her own theology in the open air of Paris, debated in the schools where Abelard taught, would we know her name the way we know his? Would her mind be in our textbooks? Or would the church have found another way to make her disappear? I have finally learned that the finest minds are not those who never suffer. They are those who suffer and refuse to stop thinking. Leave a comment below. Would Héloïse be remembered differently if she were alive today? And share this with someone who's never heard this story, because that is exactly what they tried to prevent.